First of all, I would like to welcome you all at our today's ZEF public lecture. In this occasion, we would like to hear a presentation from Dr. Murad Ali under the title, China's Belt and Road, G7's Build Back Better World and EU's Global Gateway, a means of sustainable development or a zero-sum game. Before the presentation begins, allow me to introduce our today's presenter. Dr. Murad Ali is the head of the Department of Political Science at the University of Malacca in Pakistan. He obtained his PhD from the Massey University in New Zealand in 2012. In 2016, he became the first Pakistani to receive Germany's highly competitive and prestigious Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung, a postdoctoral research fellowship in the category of social sciences. He has published widely in peer-reviewed academic journals on the political economy of international aid and development effectiveness. He is the author of The Politics of US Aid to Pakistan, Aid Allocation and Delivery from Truman to Trump. It's published with Routledge. He contributes regularly to the one of the famous English daily of Pakistan called the News International. Without further delay, I would like to welcome Dr. Murad to deliver his presentation. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Dr. Fazal. Thank you, other colleagues. My pleasure. Good evening, probably good afternoon to you all. Probably you might be enjoying pleasant weather. It's a bit heat wave here, so this climate change is real. In March, we are having quite warm or quite hot season in spring. So the presentation, the title is China's BRI, G7's Build Back Better World, B3W and EU's Global Gateway, a means of sustainable development or a zero-sum game. Whether these three initiatives, they will lead to sustainable development in developing countries as a source of financial means, technological means, or whether it will lead to strategic competition between the US on the one side and China on the other, and between China and its European countries or EU. This is the topic of the presentation. A brief outline of the presentation. I will briefly mention the BRI considered as a Chinese project of the century, which is a transcontinental multi-sector project with global outreach. The number of countries that are involved, the number of institutions that are involved, it's very diverse. On almost all continents, we can see the visibility of China and China's increasing presence in these countries in different sectors. Then a brief overview of the G7's B3W, which they say is an alternative to the BRI, which is value-driven, market-led. It's a high standard and it's transparent, unlike many of the BRI's projects, which somehow are clouded in some opaque, no transparency, etc. But when it comes to resources, so not that much visible in terms of practical implementation of projects in contrast or in comparison with the BRI. And then the EU's Global Gateway was about 300 billion euro that EU countries and EU institutes will provide to developing countries between 2021 and 2027 to fund infrastructure projects in developing countries. And then I will conclude whether these are complementary or they are competing with each other. Next slide, please. So, I mean, probably it's not very visible, but it just shows the number of projects, the amount of investment that China is having in almost all continents, in numerous countries, in Africa, in Asia, in Eastern Europe, in Latin America. So increasing visibility, increasing footmarks of Chinese private sector, of state-owned enterprises, of Chinese banks that are funding projects. So increasing role of China and China-owned actors. Next slide, please. So how did it evolve? Where did it come from? So it was during his visit to Kazakhstan in 2013 that President Xi Jinping outlined the idea of the BRI, which he later on explained during his visit to Indonesia the same year. And basically, it aimed to revive the old connecting routes or trade routes connecting China with Asian countries, with European countries, with African countries. There are about 65 countries who are signatory to the BRI, which covers about 60% of the global population. and about a third of the global GDP and global merchandise trade. So, I mean, when it comes to the number of countries, almost every continent, as I have mentioned, they have signed to the BRI projects. And China has been funding projects, infrastructure projects in these countries. Currently, it's about 1.4 trillion and still growing. It's believed that China's financial commitment to these projects is 11 times the size of the Marshall Plan, if calculated in current dollars value. So, I mean, an incredible amount of investment, an incredible amount of financial contribution from Chinese actors, from Chinese state-owned enterprises by any margin. Next slide, 5 number. And of course, China has also worked on it, how to use institutions, how to bring different institutions, how they are involved. So the role of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is quite visible. Although some of the members of the AIB, they have not been very enthusiastic about the BRI, and they have asked China not to involve too much of the AIB in these projects, but of course, still it has a significant role. China Development Bank is the Silk Road Fund, Export-Import Bank of China, and BRICS led a new development bank. These are different financial institutions that are involved in funding and financing the BRI projects. And when it was started, so within a couple of years, the overall FDI by Chinese state-owned enterprises and private firms, it was about 183 billion in many developing countries. And by the end of 2016, overall contribution of the 3 largest banks of China, it was about 225 billion in these projects. And in 2017, when there was the first Belt and Road Initiative Forum, the BRI Forum, President Xi announced an additional 100 billion yuan, about 15 billion to the Silk Road Fund. And also the government announced another 60 billion yuan, or about 8.7 billion to be given as grants to fund further BRI projects in these countries. Next page, please. So what are the motivations behind, what are the key goals and objectives? So at one level, it is believed in that it will lead to industrialization in many developing countries. It will lead to infrastructure upgradation in many countries who need financial resources to modernize their infrastructure. It will lead to increased trade and regional connectivity between countries participating in the BRI projects. It will also lead to transfer of knowledge and technology, and China particularly has tremendous knowledge when it comes to building infrastructure projects. So it has know-how, it has technology, and it wants to share this knowledge and technology with developing countries. And ultimately, it will lead to sustainable development, to SDGs in many countries with industrialization, innovative infrastructure, etc. So it will lead to sustainable development in many BRI countries. At the same time, there are also domestic dynamics and imperatives behind the BRI. For example, within China, incredible amount of inequality between the mainland regions and the coastal areas, and China want to reduce that regional disparity within China to bring the mainland regions at par with the coastal regions. Also, as we know, China is sometimes dubbed as the global factory. It's the largest trading nation. So it has tremendous production overcapacity when it comes to steel, cement, iron, and many other commodities. So it has tremendous amount of production capacity, and somehow it wants to export this excessive capacity to many developing countries to fund projects, to implement projects there, and also excessive foreign reserves to get rid of it and to invest somewhere in other countries. And of course, creating new markets for Chinese companies and for Chinese labor, Chinese engineers, Chinese companies to work as consultants, to work as engineers. We have examples in Pakistan, for example, CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So very clear visibility of Chinese workers in Pakistan in different sectors of the economy. And as I mentioned, excessive holding of US dollars. So it has a tremendous amount of foreign resource and it want to utilize this money in funding funding projects in many countries. So overall, the narrative is that it's a win-win proposition for China and BRI countries, that it will be supporting the participating countries, and also it will have many benefits for China. So the win-win proposition, it appears more in official documents. Now, of course, the question can be raised, and there have been criticism that, I mean, who is the winner, who is the loser? Of course, both are not equal, but the narrative is there. Next page, please.
Just change it.
The global outreach, for example, to showcase the success and to show the achievements to share with the greater international community and to get international support. The first Belt and Road Forum was held in 2017. 57 countries participated, including 29 heads of the states and governments, including Prime Minister of Pakistan and other regional countries. And then the 7th BRI was held in 2019. 39 of the governments and delegates from 150 countries participated. 92 international organizations and over 6,000 foreign guests participated in the BRI. Overall, more than 550 projects agreements were signed at the 2 BRI forums in many areas, in energy sector, in infrastructure, economic corridor, in special economic zones. It has been a new buzzword in many countries. But as we mentioned, the competition and the reservations of some major powers that boycotted or stayed away from these BRI forums, the United States, European Union, Japan, Australia, and India, they have stayed away from these BRI forums. They are not signatory to the BRI. And these countries, they have multiple reservations, strategic and security concerns of some countries. For example, India, which has some problem with Pakistan on some disputes, regional disputes on Kashmir issue, etc. And as many projects, they have passed to the Kashmir region, so that problem is there. And some countries' financial soundness, some say that these projects, they are leading to debt risks and debt trap in some countries. The big example is the Hambantota puts up Sri Lanka, which is a kind of Achilles heel in this whole BRI projects. That it's a big example that, you know, countries, they will be in debts and it will create problem. They are not financially sustainable, these projects. And of course, environmental and social concerns. For example, many of the projects, they are, particularly the energy projects, they are based on coal-based energy. And I mean, in 21st century, we already have the implications of environment and global warming and all these things. So environmental concerns are there. So these powers, they have stayed away from the BRI and from BRI forums. Next page. So to counter or to come up with an alternative, it was the in the last year during the G7 summits, these countries, the G7 members, they came up with their own initiative known as the Build Back Better World, which was primarily a US and G7 initiative, how we can have an alternative with the BRI. But if you look at the broader political picture, so the US policy that has, you know, evolved since the Obama time has pivoted to Asia, how rebalancing act they call it. So it's economic focus of the US and the wider Indo-Pacific region and how to increase its role there to counter the rising influence of China in the Indo-Pacific region. So this pivot to Asia strategy is to intensify the US role in this Asia-Pacific region and to have more protection to its allies in South Korea, Australia, Japan, and Taiwan. So three critical areas of US policy are military planning, foreign policy, and economic and trade. And they also came up with this Indo-Pacific Economic Corridor, IPEC. It was a US policy, but still that's in an evolving phase and no concrete visible projects that could be observed. For example, an ADB report said that an amount of $73 billion they are needed for connectivity through roads, railways, and maritime port connectivity to link South and Southeast Asia. So tremendous amount of money and resources they are needed to have increased connectivity between these two regions, South and Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. During the G7 summit, it was stated that if China has its BRI, and we think that there is a much more equitable way to provide for the needs of countries around the world, US President Biden stated during the summit, and then they came up with this B3W initiative, which they state has the potential to improve global welfare, reinforce good governance systems, and strengthen partnerships, as there has been criticism on China that the partnerships, they are not that much transparent, they are not equal, they are spreading their own ideologies, kind of leading to authoritarian regimes in some of the participating countries. So the BRI is an alternative to that particular system that China has been trying to promote. So they also mentioned that the world is currently faced with about US 40 trillion infrastructure gap, and the US and G7 countries, they will provide resources to enable developing countries to have access to some financial resources. There's a physical infrastructure, the projects will be financed, including fiber optic cables, clean transport corridors, clean power transmission lines, to strengthen digital transport and energy networks. So they're focusing on this word clean and green in comparison to the BRIs, which has funded mostly coal-based projects. And as they mentioned, attractive investment and business-friendly trading conditions, regulatory convergence, standardization, supply chain integration, and financial services. Some of the key features of the BRI, which these countries say that China is lacking in its BRI, and these features, these key principles, they will be adhered to in the B3W initiative. Next page, please. Recently, it was probably in December 2021, last year, the EU came up, they unveiled another initiative termed as Global Gateway Initiative. And they said that we will be aiming to mobilize an investment of about 300 billion euro between 2021 and 2027. And they will adopt a Team Europe approach involving members like the EU, the member states, and then European financial institutions and national development finance institutions. They will be playing a key role to fund infrastructure projects in many developing countries. And they have been claiming that values like democratic values and high standards, good governance, transparency, equal partnership, green and clean. So as I mentioned, in contrast to some of the BRI or many of the BRI projects which have problem regarding environment, regarding clean and green projects. So this has been the key motto, narrative that these US and its allies, they have been advocating. Global Gateway is fully aligned with the US 2030 agenda and sustainable development goals in the Paris Agreement. And of course, in that regard, of course, they have clearly stated that we will adhere to the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. Also, the UN and other UNDP, other UN agencies, they have stated in their policy documents that the BRI is also supporting in achieving the SDGs in many countries, in many regions, when in fund infrastructure projects, access to energy, or in terms of industrialization, creating employment opportunities for many societies, many countries. So in that sense, both have a kind of contribution towards the 2030 agenda. Next, please. So when we study all these three grand initiatives, so I mean, the debate whether they are contributing to global public goods, GPGs, or whether it's a strategic competition between these powerful actors. So if you look, for example, at the 2030 agenda on sustainable development goals, there is no doubt that the agenda requires significant resources, huge resources to fund infrastructure projects to make tangible progress towards the achievement of the SDGs. For example, the OECD report has stated that the annual SDG financing gap in developing countries is estimated at approximately 2.5 trillion. So a significant amount that cannot be covered by foreign aid or grants, etc. So, I mean, unprecedented financial resources are required to achieve the SDGs at the global level. For example, in Asia alone, over the 15 years period from 2016 to 2030, investment worth $26 trillion or US 1.7 trillion for years required in 4 sectors comprising transport, power, telecommunications, and water supply and sanitation. So whether it's globally or the Asian region, tremendous resources are needed to make tangible, significant progress. And for example, the South Asian region, one of the densely populated regions, about 25% of the global population. If you study the needs of these developing countries in Pakistan and India, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, so tremendous resources are needed to make a progress toward the SDGs. And the SDG 17 also clearly mentions that we need to mobilize additional financial resources for developing countries from multiple sources. So as I mentioned, foreign aid or development aid is insignificant. It's just 135 billion or 140 billion per year, which is in no way enough to enable these countries to make some progress. So that's why the SDGs has mentioned that we need to enhance North-South, South-South, and triangular regional and international cooperation on and access to science, technology, innovation, and enhanced knowledge sharing. So whether it's the relationship between the North-South, developed and developing countries, or South-South cooperation, China, Brazil, India, and other developing countries which are sharing their experiences with developing countries or sharing their resources with developing countries, they can play a significant role to enable these developing countries to make progress towards the SDGs. And it was because of this most countries, the BRI participating countries, they see the BRI as a win-win situation, and many have joined because when it comes to infrastructure projects, so whether this World Bank or ADB or other development organization, they find it very hard to get access to financial resources to finance or implement infrastructure projects. That's why China seems to be a viable option. China is ready to show, China is willing to share resources, China is ready to offer resources, and developing countries, they need resources. So they have a viable option, and then that's why they line towards Beijing to have access to these resources. Next, please. But at the same time, we see the BRI or this initiative as GPGs or how they can contribute sustainable development. At the same time, if you look at the polarization globally, trade war between China and the US, and this competition, somehow it was a competition, but now it's becoming more open. If you see the current policies and current alliances emerging in the Indo-Pacific region, there is a dominant consensus that the BRI is a strategic initiative than economic or domestic political one. If we see many of the current books from Doshi or Michael Beckel or Pillsbury, the China threat, the China marathon, China is there to displace the US from the global leadership, and so lots of literature coming on this particular issue. And as they have mentioned that by many accounts, China is the most significant competitor that the US has faced, and that the way Washington handles its emergence to superpower status will share the course of the next century. So, I mean, time and again, we see these images that we observe. It's a competition between these powers, and strategic competition or zero-sum game, or the new great game they call it, or the Cold War mentality that China accuses these countries. But one thing is sure that US-China competition is primarily a competition of who will lead regional or global order. So that's why Doshi is in his recent book has termed it, it's a zero-sum game because it is a positional good, that is one's roles within the hierarchy. So this dominant perception that the BRI is basically a political tool, a strategic tool to displace US from its global role. This thinking is there. And that's why it has also led to some other initiative that gives urgency to these particular perceptions. For example, the re-emergence of the quadrilateral security dialogue, or the Quad. It's a coalition of Australia, India, Japan, and the US in the Indo-Pacific. This organization was there. It was active in 2007, 2006, when the tsunami had hit these countries, but it remained mostly dormant. It went into hibernation, but recently it has been reinvigorated, and they recently had the first virtual summit of the head of the state. They have been holding regular meetings how to counter the rising role of China. Although on some accounts, even these actors do not agree when it comes to rule-based navigation or the specific geographical position of Indo-Pacific. They don't agree even on the definition on the Indo-Pacific region. But still, I mean, they on one point they have convergence how to contain the rising China. The creation of new pacts, for example, most notably the AUKUS, which was signed recently, the trilateral alliance between Australia, the UK, and the US, that the US and the UK will share technology to enable Australia to come up with some technology or nuclear run submarines, and France was quite angry with this. As a European actor, France had to probably withdraw its ambassador from Australia, but Australia somehow, remained firm, and the agreement was signed. So it's also a symbol of some strategic shift in the region, particularly the Indo-Pacific region. There's another alliances there. And recently, I think it was 2022, just recently, this Department of Defense, they have requested the government, the Biden administration, to provide 5 billion additional amount for this Pacific Debtors Initiative to have more deployment, active role in the Indo-Pacific. And the UR initiative will cost about $27 billion from 2021 to 2027. And overall, this is in addition to about $66 billion that the US has been spending in the Indo-Pacific in different military campaigns, and this naval fleet and their presence there. So increasing role of US and its allies in the greater Indo-Pacific region, how to contain the role of China. That's why China has also condemned, they said that it's enclosed and small cliques, and they show that, they have been exaggerating the China threat, and China accuses these countries of, living in the Cold War mentality, etc. So whatever, but the fact remains that these emerging, they are appearing in this particular region. Next slide, please. So now when we look at all these scenarios and the three grand initiative, whether it's a means of sustainable development, whether it will provide access of developing countries to have access to resources, alternatives of sources, or whether it is leading to a strategic competition and at the end zero-sum game. Broadly looking at this initiative, there are ample opportunities, increased complementarity among these projects to lead to connectivity, trade, investment, infrastructure upgradation, access to energy, and all these things. So there's complementarity in that sense of the three projects. Somehow there is convergence of goals and some mutual, trust and solidarity. Somehow, to get rid of this Cold War mentality or big, powers competition, bloc politics, as they call it in Pakistan. But I mean, it's very difficult to say that we should be like that and that, because it's a global competition between great powers. So it's how things are unfolding in the region. Increasing mistrust between the US on the one side and China on the other, and somehow also US allies siding with the US trade war that we observed with the Trump administration and the Chinese administration. So if these kind of thinking they prevail, then we say it can be a zero-sum game. If it's just to fund projects that are militarily significant, strategically significant, not focusing on sustainability or not focusing on what are the actual needs of developing countries in these regions. So it will lead to only politicization of these projects. So the three grand strategies, as I concluded, they can either stimulate sustainable development or strategic competition. So if implemented properly, in good spirit, it's a win-win situation for all the participants, for aid providers, for big powers, and of course for developing countries. But if the strategic competition between choosing sides, either you are with us or against us, then developing countries, they are also stuck because they need resources. The fact is, sometimes I laugh with my students. I mean, you have stomach and it needs food. So developing countries, they need these resources to bring infrastructure development, to finance energy projects, to make roads and railway lines and all these things. So developing countries, they have no access. They have to take sides. I mean, even if you try to remain neutral, so this is very complex scenario. It's not clear, black and white, some gray areas. So let's see how it goes. I mean, with the commoners, the common masses can just wish that sanity prevails for the greater good of humanity. That's all from my side. Thank you. Question, discussion, I welcome that.